Welcome to English Reading for Learning.
Speak English. Chapter 1. A big crowd of people rushed toward us, looking for their friends and families. They had just gotten off a plane at the Cincinnati, Ohio airport, which is actually in Kentucky. I'd never seen Uncle Arturo in person, but it was easy for me to spot him. With his short beard and round glasses, he looked just like his pictures in our scrapbooks at home. He also looked a lot like my mom, except for the beard, of course. That made sense, since Mom was his sister. "Hola, Tío Arturo," I called. That meant, "Hello, Uncle Arturo." Mom had told me that Uncle Arturo didn't speak much English. I wanted to show him that I spoke Spanish, at least a little. Uncle Arturo hurried over to us and gave me a warm hug. "Hola, Isabel," he said. Then he spoke so fast that I caught only a few words. I knew that niña meant girl and sobrina meant niece, but the words in between, well, I glanced at Mom for help, but she just winked at me. I do understand a lot of Spanish, as long as it's spoken slowly. However, Uncle Arturo clearly didn't know the rules for speaking Spanish to me. My uncle would be staying with us for 2 weeks. He was going to be in some kind of concert in Cincinnati. His wife, Aunt Carmen, couldn't take 2 weeks off from her job. She had to stay at home in Mexico City. Uncle Arturo played the violin, and my mom played the piano. She wouldn't be playing in the concert, though. Still, she gave lessons to kids almost every day after school and on Saturday mornings. She had taught me how to play the piano, too. I wondered if Uncle Arturo gave violin lessons back in Mexico City. Maybe I would ask him, as soon as I figured out the right words in Spanish. When we got home, it was already dinner time. Mom had prepared a feast to welcome Uncle Arturo to Cincinnati. She had even made her famous corn tortillas. Tonight, she stuffed them with chicken to make enchiladas. We also had plenty of fresh, homemade salsa, of course. It was a warm day for late October, so after dinner we sat on the front porch and talked. At least, Mom, Dad, and Uncle Arturo talked. My mom and Dad were born in Mexico, so they speak Spanish well. My brother, Greg, was only 6. He knew about as much Spanish as I did, so the two of us didn't add much to the conversation. That's why I was glad when my best friend Toshi and her sister Keiko walked past our house. They lived down the street and were on their way to the park on the corner. Toshi motioned for me to come with them. I turned to my parents and asked, "May I go?" "Hey, Toshi and Keiko," my mom called. "Come and meet Isabel's uncle, Arturo." Uh-oh, I thought. Toshi and Keiko didn't speak Spanish at all, as far as I knew. This was going to be a very short conversation. To my surprise, Uncle Arturo stood up, bowed to Toshi and Keiko, and said, "Konnichiwa." Konnichiwa? What did that mean? I was pretty sure I had never heard that Spanish word. "Oh," Keiko said in surprise. Then she smiled and bowed a little to Uncle Arturo. "Konnichiwa," she told him. "Do you speak Japanese?" she asked him in English. He grinned and said, "No, yo hablo español." I knew that Uncle Arturo had just said, "No, I speak Spanish," but what did konnichiwa mean? Toshi turned to me and explained, "Your uncle said hello in Japanese." "Oh," I mumbled. I could tell from the way Toshi and Keiko were smiling that they already loved my uncle. I just hoped that everyone wasn't going to start talking in Japanese now. "Isabel's uncle is visiting us from Mexico City," Mom told my friends. In English, thank goodness. "He's going to play in a concert." She turned to Uncle Arturo just as he covered a big yawn with his hand. Mom patted his arm and said, "You've had a long journey today, Arturo. I'll show you where your bedroom is, okay?" Uncle Arturo smiled and said, "Gracias." Then he stood up and told us, "Hasta mañana," before following Mom into the house. That means, "See you tomorrow," I told my friends. Toshi nodded. I can't believe your uncle knows how to say hello in Japanese, she said. Does he know any other Japanese words? I shrugged. I didn't even know he could say that one. I just wish he knew more English, I said. It's hard to talk to him for sure. I can't tell how much English he understands either. I wonder if the people who are going to play in that concert with him know that he doesn't speak much English. I think my uncle's going to need someone to help him with English the whole time he's here. I sure hoped that I wouldn't get stuck with that job. Chapter 2. Every morning for the next week, Mom drove Uncle Arturo into the city so he could practice for the concert. She told me that several of the other musicians spoke Spanish, so he'd be fine. Each afternoon, she picked him up. Uncle Arturo got home about the time that Greg and I got home from school. Then Mom usually had to give piano lessons. What did Uncle Arturo do for the rest of the day? You'll be surprised. He had been to the United States only a few times. He had never been to Cincinnati before. Still, he didn't want to go to the museums or the aquarium or the baseball stadium by the river. He just wanted to walk around the neighborhood and see the trees. I guess the trees never change color in Mexico City. It stays hot there all year. On that first Monday, Mom asked me to go with my uncle on his walk. Just make sure he doesn't get lost, Isabel, she whispered. You can help him practice his English, too. I think he's a little embarrassed about it. I tagged along with my uncle. Still, pretty soon I could tell that he knew the streets as well as I did. He tried to talk to me in English, I think. My parents have lived in the States for about 12 years now. They still have a slight accent, but Uncle Arturo, well, sometimes I wasn't sure what language he was speaking. Maybe it was more Japanese. On Tuesday, when I got home from school, Uncle Arturo was waiting for me. He smiled and said, "Walk?" He pointed at the front door in case I didn't understand. So I nodded, slipped off my backpack, and headed back outside with him. I wondered how far Uncle Arturo wanted to walk today. Maybe I could guide him toward the park. I figured that Toshi and some other kids from the neighborhood might be there. I knew my uncle could easily find his way home by himself now. More cold next day? Uncle Arturo asked. I don't know, I told him. Shivering a little, he said, I need more hacket. Hacket? What's a hacket? Then I noticed that my uncle was zipping up his jacket. Oh, you mean jacket, I told him. Jacket starts with a J, not an H. I said jacket slowly for him. Uncle Arturo watched me closely. Then he slowly said, hacket. Wasn't he listening? I shook my head and said, no, like this. Suddenly my uncle turned and walked away, mumbling, we go home. I almost had to run to keep up with him. As we rushed toward home, Uncle Arturo didn't say a word. Look at that yellow tree over there, I said, pointing. I think it's the prettiest one on the whole street. Sí, he said, without looking at the tree or at me. Yes, but in Spanish. I knew my uncle was angry with me, but I was only trying to help. How was he going to speak better English if someone didn't show him how to say the words? We were about a block from home when my friend Shayna and her big brother Benjamin came riding toward us on their bikes. Hi, Isabel, Shayna called. They stopped, so I had to introduce my uncle to them. Uncle Arturo smiled and said, hello, but that was all. Uncle Arturo is from Mexico City, I told them, and he's staying with us for 2 weeks. Oh, that's nice, Shayna said. Then there was silence. Why didn't Uncle Arturo say something? I felt my face start to get red. Finally, Benjamin said, well, we better get going. As they took off down the street, Shayna called back over her shoulder, it was nice to meet you. Sí, he told her. As Uncle Arturo and I walked the rest of the way home in silence, I couldn't help feeling a little bit angry. Was my uncle trying to embarrass me in front of my friends? After dinner that night, I helped my dad clean up the kitchen. During the meal, the adults had talked mostly in Spanish again. I couldn't help feeling left out. "Why do you use Spanish so much at dinner time?" I finally asked Dad. "Everyone talks so fast that I don't know what you're saying most of the time." Nodding, he said, "I know that, Isabel. Still, Uncle Arturo feels more comfortable speaking Spanish, and he's our guest." I frowned as I dried another plate and put it away. How was Uncle Arturo going to learn English if he spoke only Spanish? Thank goodness he'll be here just 2 weeks, I thought. After he goes back to Mexico, at least I can talk to my parents at dinner time again. All Greg ever wants to talk about are his action heroes. Boring. That night, as I was falling asleep, I thought about the next day. Would my uncle want me to go for a walk with him after school? Or would he still be mad at me? If we did go for a walk, how could I make sure that we wouldn't meet any more of my friends? I was embarrassed today when we met Shayna and Benjamin. At least Uncle Arturo could have asked, "How are you?" I knew he could say that. However, when I got home from school on Wednesday, Mom wanted me to go to the mall with her. I'm not sure what Uncle Arturo did. "We're going to find you a really nice dress to wear to the concert," Mom told me. I nodded, but I wondered why I had to get dressed up. Mom held recitals for her piano students twice a year. She used a church a few blocks from our house. No one got really dressed up then. What was so special about this concert anyway? I just hoped it wasn't too long. Chapter 3. By Thursday, the weather was much colder. When Uncle Arturo got home from practicing, he didn't want to go for a walk. Instead, he asked Mom to please drive him to the mall. He wanted to buy a new jacket. I tried not to roll my eyes when he said, "Hack it." Greg got to go play at his friend's house, but Mom wanted me to come with them. She said I needed new shoes to go with my new dress. I sighed. I had been planning to wear my old sneakers. After all, my new dress was almost long enough to cover my shoes. No one would even see what I had on my feet. As the three of us walked through the mall, I kept watching for my friends from school. I hoped I wouldn't see any of them. I didn't want another embarrassing scene where everyone stood around like statues. Soon, though, Mom saw a dress she liked in a store window. "I think I'll go in and try that dress on," she told us. "I need something special to wear to the concert, too." "Isabel," she said, "you know where the department store is. Would you help Uncle Arturo find a jacket he likes? I'll meet you there." Oh, boy. "Sure, Mom," I said. Uncle Arturo nodded and smiled. He looked happy, so I hoped he wasn't mad at me anymore. He really was nice, even if he couldn't speak much English. In the department store, though, my uncle pretended that he spoke no English at all. When a sales clerk came over to help us, Uncle Arturo asked her a question in Spanish. She looked totally confused, so I had to translate. "He wants to look at some jackets," I told her. Then Uncle Arturo started talking to her a mile a minute. I understood the words verde and caliente, green and hot, but that was all. "Lentamente, por favor," I said to my uncle. "Slowly, please." He talked a little more slowly, so I was finally able to translate his question for the clerk, who then found him 2 warm green jackets with zippers. Uncle Arturo liked the one that was on sale, so I figured that our shopping trip was over. But then my uncle pointed to his head and asked the clerk for a sombrero. This time she understood and smiled. "You want a hat? Let me show you some handsome ones." Now my uncle looked at me in confusion. "Guapo," I told him. "Handsome." Where was my mother, anyway? Shopping with Uncle Arturo was just too hard. Then it got worse. I spotted Stephen, who took piano lessons from my mother. He and his mom were looking through a rack of boys' coats. I quickly moved behind a rack of clothes and bent down, pretending to tie my sneaker. Just then my uncle asked the clerk another question, in Spanish, of course. Where was my mother? Uncle Arturo and the clerk looked down at me for help. I was kneeling on the floor behind the coats. I had already retied both of my sneakers very neatly, so now I had to stand up. "Isabel," my uncle repeated way too loudly, "cuánto cuestan el sombrero y la chaqueta?" Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Stephen look our way. I sighed and told the clerk, "He wants to know how much the hat and jacket cost." As the clerk added up the prices, I heard Stephen yell, "Hey, Isabel!" Without looking, I just knew he was already on his way over to us. Oh, boy, where was my mother? "How long have you been here?" Stephen asked me. "I've been shopping with my mom for hours. She shops till she drops." Uncle Arturo frowned as he looked over at Stephen's mother. I introduced Stephen to my uncle. "Uncle Arturo lives in Mexico," I explained, "but he's staying with us for 2 weeks." "Hi," Stephen said. "I hope Isabel doesn't make you spend the whole 2 weeks shopping." My uncle smiled, but he looked puzzled. Fortunately, Stephen's mom called him just then. "Cuidado," Uncle Arturo said as Stephen hurried away. Stephen stopped and looked at me in confusion. "He said, 'Be careful,'" I explained. Of course, that made Stephen even more confused. After Stephen left, my uncle paid for his jacket and hat, but Mom was still nowhere in sight, so we headed into the mall to look for her. As we walked, I realized that I really didn't know much about my uncle. "What kind of work do you do in Mexico?" I asked him in Spanish. Uncle Arturo looked surprised. "I play the violin," he told me in Spanish. "Well, I know that," I said. "Do you give violin lessons to kids after school like my mom gives piano lessons?" "Sometimes I give lessons to very special students," he told me. "However, I don't have much time to give lessons because I must practice many hours a day." "But when do you work at your job?" I asked. Uncle Arturo stopped walking, so I did too. He looked at me, frowning a little, and said, "The violin is my job, Isabel. It's my whole life." Just then my mom called to us. She was coming out of a store carrying a new dress inside a bag. "I found a beautiful dress," she said with a big smile, "and I see you bought a coat, Arturo. Now let's go find some new shoes for you, Isabel." As we headed for the shoe store, I thought about what Uncle Arturo had said. How could a violin be his whole life? Chapter 4. The next week, Uncle Arturo went downtown to practice every day. After school, we went on a few more of our walks. Unfortunately, my uncle's English did not get a whole lot better. I talked to him in English so he could practice understanding it. Mostly, though, he answered me in Spanish. The good news was that we didn't meet any more of my friends on our walks. Finally, it was Saturday and time for the concert. Dad drove Uncle Arturo downtown early in the afternoon for one more practice session. How much could someone practice anyway? We had an early dinner so everyone would have time to get dressed. I didn't think I'd ever seen my mom so excited. I was buttoning up my new dress when she rushed into my bedroom holding a special barrette. It had 3 pearls on it and used to belong to Mom's grandmother. "Isabel, you can wear Grandma's barrette tonight," she said. "We all want to look our very best, right?" Mom handed it to me and hurried out again without waiting for my answer. Out in the hall, I heard her say, "Not those shoes, Greg. Where are your new ones?" Finally, we drove downtown to the music hall. Dad looked really handsome in his suit. Mom's new dress made her look even more fantastic than usual. This was the first time I had ever seen Greg in a suit. His tie seemed to be strangling him. The front of the huge music hall was really lit up. We joined a crowd of people hurrying up the steps to the front doors. When we got inside, I couldn't believe my eyes. There on the wall was a huge picture of Uncle Arturo. I stood there with my mouth open, staring at it. "Isn't that a great picture of him?" my mom asked with shiny eyes. I quickly looked around, but there weren't any pictures of anyone else. "Why," I mumbled. Mom looked at me in surprise. "You knew your uncle was the featured performer tonight, didn't you, Isabel?" "No, I didn't know that, but I didn't want to admit it. How could I have missed that?" Greg and I followed our parents as an usher led us to our seats. Uncle Arturo had arranged for us to have the best seats in the hall. We sat in the front, not far from where the musicians were tuning their instruments. The confusion of the tuning matched the confusion in my head. Who could have guessed that my uncle was so important? I could hear flutes, clarinets, trumpets, tubas, kettle drums, and even a harp all playing at once. I spotted a whole row of violinists, but I couldn't see my uncle. Finally, the musicians were quiet. The orchestra conductor came out and stood in the center of the stage. He was dressed in a tuxedo. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he said with a big smile. "You have come to a very special performance of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra. We are so fortunate to have with us one of the world's most accomplished violinists. Please welcome Senor Arturo Moreno." Everyone stood up and started applauding. My uncle walked out on the stage, all dressed up. He stood next to the announcer and bowed to the crowd. I thought people would never stop clapping. I glanced over at my family. Mom's cheeks were wet, but I knew those were happy tears. I even saw my dad wipe his eyes with the back of his hand. Greg just stared at my uncle standing on the stage. I was glad to see that at least one other person was as surprised as I was. Finally, everyone sat down. A hush settled over the music hall. The orchestra began to play a symphony that I had heard before, although I didn't know its name. My head filled with the music. Still, the best part was when my uncle stepped forward and began to play by himself. His violin sang. The music was so sweet and pure. It sounded as if my uncle were describing something or someone he loved with all his heart. As he played, I remembered that Aunt Carmen was back in Mexico City. I guessed that Uncle Arturo missed her very much. When my uncle stopped playing, no one made a sound for a minute or two. Everyone listened until the last notes of his music disappeared into the air. Then applause thundered through the hall. Next, Uncle Arturo played another symphony with the orchestra. The music soared around us, first quiet and fragile, then powerful. Through it all, I could hear the high, sweet sounds of my uncle's violin. Soon it seemed it was time for intermission. Everyone stood up and began talking at once. We got out of our seats and moved into the aisle. Still, so many people stopped to talk to us that we never got any farther. "Your brother put so much heart into his playing," one woman told my mom. "I never want him to stop. I just wish he could play for us more often." "You must be very proud of your uncle," a smiling man said to me. Yes, I am," I mumbled. The man probably wondered why my face was getting red. Why in the world did I ever think Uncle Arturo had to speak perfect English? After a while, the lights flickered a couple of times. That was the signal for everyone to sit down. The orchestra played again, but only as a background for my uncle. All eyes and ears were on him. "This is Schubert's Symphony No. 9 in C major," my mom whispered to me. "It's very difficult to play." I could see that. The music had a complicated melody, but it kept getting more powerful. By the time Uncle Arturo finished playing, many people in the audience were wiping their eyes. After the concert, we waited for Uncle Arturo. It took a long time for him to reach us. So many people wanted him to stop and talk to them. As he got nearer, I heard a number of people speak to him in Spanish. Then Uncle Arturo grinned and spoke rapidly with them. When someone spoke in English, he just smiled and nodded without saying anything. Maybe I could work harder to help Uncle Arturo learn to speak more English. I would have to be a lot more patient, though. Then maybe, just maybe, he would teach me how to play the violin. But then I remembered that my uncle gave lessons only to very special students. I knew how to play the piano. However, I had never even held a violin before. I didn't think that knowing nothing about a violin was what my uncle meant by a very special student. Yet I really wanted to learn how to play a violin. I wanted to make it sing, as my uncle did. Now, though, I was running out of time. It was Saturday. Uncle Arturo was flying back to Mexico City on Monday. Look at all the days I had wasted. I had spent Uncle Arturo's visit wishing that he spoke better English. Instead, I could have learned a new language myself, the language of the violin. Uncle Arturo could say things with his violin that no one could say in words, English or Spanish. Chapter 5. On Sunday afternoon, Mom and Dad invited some friends to come over and meet my uncle. He had asked my mom not to ask people over before the concert so he could concentrate on practicing. Most of my parents' friends knew at least a little Spanish. The conversation that afternoon switched from Spanish to English and back again, but I understood most of it. Well, part of it. Finally, everyone went home, and the house was quiet again. "Isabel, do you have time for one more walk before I leave?" Uncle Arturo asked me in Spanish. "I want to see those beautiful trees once more before I return to Mexico City." "Sure," I said quickly. I hoped he didn't realize how many times I had tried to avoid walking with him. What was I thinking? As we headed down the sidewalk, I knew this was my best chance, maybe my only one. "Tio Arturo, would you please give me just one violin lesson?" I begged in Spanish. "No one in the world plays the violin better than you do. I know I'm not one of your very special students, but—" Then he put his arm around my shoulders and said in Spanish, "Niña, I would be pleased to give you a lesson. Let me talk to your mom when we get back to the house. I have something to ask her." As soon as we returned from our walk, Uncle Arturo called to Mom, "Do you still have the old violin of mine that I sent to you?" "Of course," replied Mom. "Since Isabel started playing the piano, I decided to save it for Greg." She went to the back closet and brought out the violin in its case. I had never seen this violin before. Uncle Arturo took the violin out of its case and made sure it was in tune. Then he handed it to me. I carefully took the violin from him. I held it in my left hand and tucked it under my chin. That's how I thought my uncle had held his violin during the concert, but he looked at me and smiled. Was he laughing at me? That wasn't fair. I told him I didn't know how to play a violin. I quickly handed the violin back to him and tried to blink away my tears. Then Uncle Arturo shook his head and gave the violin to me again. "You're doing fine, Isabel," he said in Spanish. "You just need a smaller violin. This one is a little too big for you." I tucked the violin under my chin again, and Uncle Arturo handed me the bow. I held the bow the way I thought I should. You really had to know how to hold it and how to move it. I didn't. When Uncle Arturo saw how I was holding the bow, he shook his head. I tried not to cry, but it wasn't easy. I couldn't seem to do anything right. "Relax your poor hand, Niña," he told me in Spanish. "Turn your wrist a little more this way. Toward the left, he meant. Your fingers should curve over the top of the bow, not squeeze it tightly." Finally, I was holding the bow correctly. Kind of. My uncle picked up his violin and tucked it under his chin. It looked as if it belonged there. I was beginning to think that a violin would never look at home under my chin. Just then, I noticed that Mom was watching. I tried to smile and look happy, but I don't think I fooled her. "Remember, Isabel," Uncle Arturo said, "good music depends on where you put the bow on the strings, how fast you move the bow, and how hard you push." "Okay," I said. I was ready to try again, I hoped. I slowly drew the bow across the violin strings, like I had watched my uncle do up on stage. Screech! Uncle Arturo winced, and I felt like covering my ears. How could a violin sound so awful? My uncle put his hand on mine to stop me from playing. I felt hot tears gathering in my eyes again and put my head down so he wouldn't see them. But Uncle Arturo put his finger under my chin and tipped my face up. "Playing the violin is not easy, Niña," he said softly. "It's much like learning how to speak English." Now the tears began slipping down my cheeks. Still, my uncle did not seem angry with me. "Together, Isabel, we will both learn new languages, no?" I nodded as he hugged me tightly. Coming into the room, Mom said, "Arturo, I don't think you've ever heard Isabel play the piano. She really is an excellent pianist." I thought that was an exaggeration, but my uncle asked, "Isabel, will you play with me?" I quickly shook my head and said, "No, I would drown out your beautiful music." He pulled me over to the piano and gently shoved me down on the stool. Then he picked up his violin and tucked it under his chin. "What we play, Nina?" he asked in English. I guessed that hundreds of musicians would give anything to play with my uncle. I really didn't deserve this honor. Besides, I could barely see the keys through my tears, and my mind was a complete blank. Mom came to my rescue. "You and Arturo have been on many walks, Isabel. You know how to play Autumn Leaves. Why don't you play it with your uncle?" Uncle Arturo gave Mom a puzzled look, so she sang a little bit of it. "The falling leaves drift by the window, the autumn leaves of red and gold." "Ah," my uncle said with a smile. Then he raised his bow and looked at me, waiting. I could see that he wasn't going to give up. Mom had found the music for Autumn Leaves in my piano book, so I took a deep breath and began to play. The notes from my uncle's violin rose and soared through our living room. They carried me all the way to the end of the song. Then Uncle Arturo would not play anything else unless I played with him. Soon it was dinner time. Afterward, my uncle had to pack for his flight the next morning. I sat on the bed and watched. He wanted me to tell him the English word for everything he was packing. "I learn English," he told me with a smile. "You learn violin." The next day, Uncle Arturo flew home. He didn't teach me how to play the violin. He did teach me that there are all kinds of languages. Everyone should know more than one.
Thanks for watching and listening. Please click like and subscribe for new and latest uploads.